This is Research Like a Pro, episode 44, How to Know Which Records to Search First. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, a Genealogist Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Nicole Dyer, co-host of the Research Like a Pro Genealogy podcast. I'm here with accredited genealogist Diana Elder. Today, we are talking about how to know which record to search first. Hi, Diana. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Excited to be here today and talking about one of my favorite subjects.
Research planning.
Yes.
Very important. All right. So for today's mini case study, I was thinking about what I could share today about, some research I've been doing. And today I was helping one of my clients build a family tree, and his ancestors are from Hungary and what is now, the Kingdom of Hungary historically, which is now Slovakia. And I had to do a lot of research into the maps and historical boundaries of the counties. It was very interesting. One of the things that I found out is that the Austria-Hungarian Empire was from 1867 to 1918, and it all coincided with all the different wars, World War I and so forth. And so I had to look at each birth date and death date and marriage date to figure out which kingdom was in charge at the time. So births before 1867 were in the Kingdom of Hungary, and marriages that were, between 1867 and 1900 were in the Austria-Hungarian Empire. So there were different jurisdictions and counties and that kind of thing. So that was an interesting case study into knowing the geography of your locality and how important it is to put those historical places into your family tree so that when you put down where they were born and where they were married, you're putting in that accurate historical information instead of what it is today, right?
Right. That's a great case study. That reminds me of when I was helping someone several years ago, and the records changed languages. So a different country came in and took over, and then all the records had to be in, say, German. And then a few years down the road, they went back to Hungarian. I'm not sure if those are the right languages, but just for an example. So I thought that was pretty fascinating, too, that you had to be able to read different languages depending on who was in charge, which makes sense, The country in charge is going to want it to be in their language. Well, news for the week. We have our eCourse sale ending on May 22nd. So if you're listening, you've got a few more days to decide if you'd like to sign up for the special sale price of $99. We have a fun webinar on Family Locket titled How to Research Like a Pro in 30 Minutes a Day. And there'll be a link in the show notes to that. So we recognize that summer is coming up and you may not want to be spending a ton of time at your computer, but maybe you don't also want to let your research lapse. And so the webinar talks all about how to go through the Research Like a Pro process in just 30 minutes a day and shows how you can actually make results or get results and make progress on your research. So one of the fun things that we wanted to do if you signed up for the eCourse during this special 2 weeks was to give you a freebie. And so I've recorded a webinar called 5 Tips for Using FamilySearch Partners that you also will get access to. So this is a fun webinar that gives you an idea of those different FamilySearch partners that are on the FamilySearch family tree, like Ancestor and MyHeritage, and then the other 3, kind of how you can use those for your research and how they can help you. One of the things that our listeners may not know is that when you do sign up for the eCourse, you get to do office hours once a month with Nicole and with me. And that's an hour-long session, and it's online. So you join from your own computer in your own home, and you get to come on and ask any questions. So say you have some kind of a research problem and you just want some help doing some planning, then you can send that in and I will help you with that. So it's kind of a fun thing. And we've had lots and lots of people come on and get their questions answered about all sorts of things like organizing and citations, you name it. We've had that questions. Anyway, that's a fun thing that comes along with the eCourse. Other people have had a lot of questions about, like, when do you have to start? When do you have to be done with it? But the eCourse is all at your own pace. You can purchase it and then you can just start it several months down the road. You can start it tomorrow. You can do it whenever you want to, and there's no time limit. And we have a fun Facebook group that you can use for feedback. So we have all sorts of fun things associated with the Research Like a Pro process. And our book is also on sale over on Amazon, the ebook for $4.99. So if you've been hearing about it, thinking maybe you want to take a look, just for $4.99, you can take a look at the ebook, see if you like it.
All right. Thanks for the announcements. I have the review today from DCAT9, and they said, "This podcast has been refreshing and gives a lot of meat on how to research your family better. I love learning new things and digging into details. I signed up for the eCourse and have been enjoying that as well. Together with the book, eCourse, and the podcast, I feel like I am ready to tackle one of those brick walls better." So great. Thank you for leaving that review, and we hope that you are enjoying the eCourse and making more progress. Hooray.
Great. Well, let's dive into our subject for the day, which is how to know which record to search first. So first, I'm just going to review steps to making a research plan. And this is in the Research Like a Pro process. None of this is really new. These are things that you may have been doing without really knowing you were doing them. So some of them may sound familiar to you, or maybe this is a brand new eye-opening method to your research. So the first thing that when we're doing a research plan is to revise our objective. You know, sometimes we have an objective for our research and we think we want to do something like find a relationship, and then we analyze all of our sources and we realize, oh, we already know a bunch of stuff. And so we decide we want to change our objective up a little bit. Right now, we have a study group going, a Research Like a Pro studying group, and several of our group members have done a revision on their objective. Once they did their thorough analysis, they've either found more information and realized that their objective, they had already met their objective doing the analysis, or they realized they needed to do something a little bit more in depth. So this is the time to take a look at all of your information that you found and make any changes to that objective. And then you do your hypothesis and you try to think about the scenario. So, for instance, if you are trying to find the parents of a woman, you would make a hypothesis. When would they have been born? You know, you just use your math and go back 20 years from her birth date and then give them a range of maybe, you know, women had children from the time they were about 20 to the time they were about 45. So you just backtrack in history to give the woman an approximate birth year. We can make our hypotheses from where people were living at a certain time. So we try to decide when people were born and where they could have been born or where they could have been living or when they might have died. It doesn't mean this has to be accurate because it's our hypothesis. We're just trying to figure out a place to search, to start our research. So once we have a hypothesis, then we identify the sources, you know, all the different types of records we could look at to answer our research objective question. And then we have to make a prioritized list because we may have come up with a list of like 20 types of sources that could answer our question. And we want to start with the ones that are the best. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is prioritizing those different types of records so that we're really making the best use of our time and not jumping into searching for things that are going to be not as useful for what we want to do.
Great review of research planning. So we do get this question a lot when we're talking about research planning in the study group and whatnot. How do you know which one you should do first? So I really think that the key to knowing which source you should search first is having studied your locality. So the more that you know about the locality that you're going to research in, the more you know which records to search first because you know which ones are the most available and useful. So the example I have for this is Scandinavian Research. So I've been following Jenny Hansen's new blog called My Favorite Ancestor. Jenny is an accredited genealogist professional, and she writes about beginning Scandinavian research, and she did it in 4 parts. And I will put the link in the show notes. And in one of the parts, I think it was part 2, she talks about which records are the best to use for Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the Scandinavian countries. And she just mentioned a few: christening, marriage, and burial records, which are kept at the parish church. And she said that many of these records are digitized and online at the Scandinavian countries' National Archives websites. So you could go to the Denmark National Archives website and go there to find those images. She said some are coming out on Ancestry, FamilySearch, Find My Past, and My Heritage as well. And then the other thing she mentioned is that for burials, the churchyards are the primary cemeteries, but because they have limited space, they only keep the graves for 25 years and then they reuse them and replace the headstone. So she was really disappointed when she went back to visit the parish of her ancestors and realized there weren't going to be any headstones from their births and deaths in the 1700s. So if that's all you know about Scandinavian research, then you'll have a pretty easy time prioritizing what sources to search. If your research question is, when was this couple married? Then you'll search in the marriage records from the parish church. So there's not a whole lot of additional records to search unless you're going into more of an advanced Scandinavian research session. So when you know about the locality, then you can realize, okay, for a burial record, I need to search the parish church records and not go look at the cemetery, because the cemetery, which is the churchyard, doesn't keep the headstones after 25 years. So then you can prioritize your search and know what to do first. So when you are doing the Research Like a Pro process, you are going to study the locality before the research planning phase. So you will have learned a lot about what records are available. If you've been looking in the FamilySearch catalog and that kind of thing, and reading the FamilySearch Wiki and reading other research guides to that state or county or country, then you should have a better idea of what records are available. So that's kind of the first place to start, is making sure that you did a good job with your locality guide.
Right. I love that. I think it's so interesting, that Scandinavian example of the cemeteries. I had no idea. I obviously have not done any research in the Scandinavian countries, but wow, how crazy that they would reuse the graves and replace the headstones.
Right. I think that's pretty common in Europe. My friend Joey said that when she went to Italy, she found the same exact thing. They did that as well.
My word, I had no idea. So, wow, that's interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this. And the next thing that I want to talk about is focusing on the records which might answer the research question. So this just comes with experience. When we just start out, we are often building a tree on FamilySearch or on Ancestry, and we get these record hints, right? And the computer throws us out a hint and says, hey, look at this marriage record. Do you think that this belongs to your person? And so one of the things that I always teach, especially beginners, is to look at the actual record. Don't just look at the index. Make sure there's an image there and take a look at it, because the actual record might have a lot more information in it. And it's going to help you learn about the records if you look at the image and read through it and understand it. So the only way to learn this genealogy stuff is practice and experience and really taking a look at the records. So the more you do that, the more you're going to realize what the records hold. And so in your research planning, you can fall back on previous experience and think, oh yeah, I remember that marriage record named the parents. And so that might be, something you want to put in your research plan, is to look for a marriage record. Or maybe you'll remember that on a death certificate, there's a place to name the parents also. And then that could be part of your research plan. So my tip is to take a look at every record. And if you have already built an ancestry tree, go back and, for fun, take an Ancestor, go through all the records that you've attached and really look at those records and see what's in them and all the different pieces of information. This is actually part of our step number 2 to do a timeline analysis, which is when you go look at each of those records and really analyze them. So you just want to become familiar with the different record types. Now, if you want to dive a little bit deeper into each record type, you might want to get a good reference book. And one of the ones that I read when I was getting ready for my accreditation testing was Val Greenwood's book. It's titled The Research Guide to American Genealogy, and he's come out with a new edition. And part of that has sections on records. It's really helpful, especially for some of those records that you may be a little afraid of, like probate or land, court, military pensions. I find myself pulling it out and looking at it because he defines a lot of the terminology that you might find when you're transcribing a record. And it gives me a little bit more knowledge about the record each time I use it. We can't always absorb everything in the records the first time we're using them. So if you're transcribing a will or using a will for the first time, you might be looking only at the names of the children that are there. But then with more experience, you may go back and you may take a look at the witnesses because you realize the witnesses were part of the associates and they are important. And then you might go back and look at something else in that will. So we return to our records over and over. We can become more familiar with them. We learn more about them. And that's how we grow as genealogists. We continue working and learning about the records.
I think you're right that we have to really study the records periodically, and especially just reviewing the records we've already found and looking at the image is helpful. Good tip. Well, recently I was reading in Tom Jones' book, Mastering Genealogical Proof, and in chapter 3 about reasonably exhaustive research, he has a great table called Suggestions for Identifying Sources to Answer Genealogical Questions. So if you have that book, take a look, and it has some great ideas for finding which sources you should search. One of the ones that I really related with was to read the research of other people who have written articles about that area or time period. So I actually did this a lot with my last project in colonial Virginia, and I found about 3 or 4 articles or books that were on the Johnson family in Virginia. And I read these articles and really paid attention to which sources they were using. So the researchers really focused on probate records, wills, deeds, land grants, and court records. And these are the best records for proving relationships and identity at this time period in Virginia. So when I made my research plan, I used these same exact records. So when you kind of learn what the others who are good researchers in your area are doing, then it will help you to know what to look for as well. So I found these articles and books on the FamilySearch books search, and I actually found some of them attached to Wikitree as sources for the people that I was looking at. So you never know where you might find the references to the authored works that might help you, but you can always look in Percy, the periodical source index on Find My Past, and you can search by place and look for articles about a certain county and then request them from the Allen County Library.
Right. I like that idea of finding out what other people are using and using the journal articles. I think that's so helpful to see how people use them. And I think that's why I love webinars or presentations at conferences that are case studies to see how other genealogists have put together their cases. And the case studies are generally indirect evidence and difficult cases. And so you can see how they've used this little piece of information here and this little piece of information there to bring it full circle. So it's just all a part of our genealogy education. So one of the tips that we want to tell everybody about is the United States Record Finder at the FamilySearch Wiki. And if you're researching in a different country, then you also have this type of a resource. You would just put in the England Record Finder or Italy Record Finder or Denmark Record Finder. And what this is on the FamilySearch Reference Wiki is a table. And the first column says, if you need, and then it has a whole list of things that you might need. So if you need an age, if you need a birth date, if you need a maiden name, if you need the religion. So any of your type of questions you might be asking, it has that in that column. And then the next column tells you where to look first. And it gives 2 or 3 different suggestions. And then the third column says, then search. So let's just take an example. So for instance, the very first one is age. So it says if you need age, look first in the census, the vital records or cemeteries. Then search military records or taxation. So, of course, this is all going to have to do with the time period and location of where you're researching. Well, I just did a case this last week, a client project, and this client project was set in the 1700s in Somerset County, Maryland. So let's take a look at each of those things. I was trying to determine the age of several children. I had a will, and the father made his will 1756, I believe, and he named all of his children. And generally, I shouldn't say always, but often, generally, the children are named in order of birth. Sometimes the father or mother will group all the sons together and then all the daughters. I've seen that. But if they're mixed up, sometimes you can tell that's the order of birth. So in this example, I had a feeling that it was pretty correct because a land record had said Charles was the oldest son in the family and he was listed first in the will. So I thought, okay, this lines up. But I needed to try to figure out when those children were born. I mean, how am I going to know what age they were? I don't have a census. There's no censuses before 1790. And vital records, no marriage records are in existence at that time. No birth records. There were no church records, nothing there. Cemeteries, there were no cemetery records. So everything in that first thing to use for age didn't work for me. So the next suggestion was to use military records. Well, there were no military records. And then last we had taxation. Well, taxation is where I was able to put the children in their places in the family and estimate their ages because we have tax records in that county from 1723 to 1859. And the laws of Maryland state that any young man, as soon as he turns 15, would show up, needed to be taxed. And so you will see the sons being listed in the father's household as dependents. And as they come of age, they are listed there. So it gives you a really good starting point for a person in the family about when they were born. So using that, I was able to estimate all the different ages of the children. And of course, these are estimations. I'm doing my best to put it together that makes sense. But of course, that far back, we can't always tell for sure how close we are, but it is better than nothing. And so in that situation, finding the age of the different children in the family had to go all the way to using taxation. But, if I was doing research in 1910, I could certainly look at the census where it clearly states how old they are. So this table is really helpful because it gives you several different ideas and maybe ideas of things you hadn't really thought about before. Different kinds of records that might give you an idea of, information or where to search for that information. So I just have to have a little shout out to my whiteboard here too, because as I was working on this family, I had put all of the records, I'd used my big whiteboard on my colored markers to lay it all out. And so that's how I was able to spot that little age and the taxation, put that together because it was right there kind of in front of me. It was fun to visualize it and figure it out.
Yeah, I'll put a link to your blog post about using a whiteboard in your research because it's a fun one. Well, as you were talking about how to find an age, I couldn't help but think about how in colonial Virginia, the record that gave a person's age sometimes that isn't on this list is a deposition in a court record. And they were stating their name and their age for the record. And then they gave their deposition. So that was helpful in identifying a year of birth for this person. So it's different depending on the time period and the locality. But tax records are great for a last resort, right?
Sometimes they're the only resort in some of these cases. And, of course, there are other records because also with age, you might have newspapers. That's one that's not listed here, but certainly newspapers would be one. So there are always those outliers too, odd records that state things, and family Bibles. I mean, we have a lot of different things that we can use, but at least the record finder gives you something to start with if you're really new or if you just need another idea to think outside the box.
Well, and it helps when you're making your prioritized strategy to make sure that you've looked at every census first for that age, or make sure that you've looked at a cemetery before you go off and search through all the tax lists, because if you haven't done the easiest, most accessible searches first, you might spend a lot of extra time searching through tax lists when you could find it in a cemetery database.
Right.
All right, well, let's look at this United States record finder for another example. So let's say that you need a death date for your ancestor. Where should you look first? Well, the United States Record Finder article at FamilySearch Wiki says that you should first look in vital records, so death certificates, and also lists to look first in cemeteries, probate records, church records, obituaries, and societies. Then, if you don't find the death date in any of those places, you can look at newspapers, Bible records, military records, and town records. So those are some good suggestions for where to search first. And then, of course, if you don't find it any of those places first, you'll want to go and find every kind of record that you can possibly think of that they might be in for your reasonably exhaustive search. Let's do another of these rows from the record finder. So let's see, how about if we want to find parents, children, and other family members? So to find those, you should look in vital records, church records, census, probate records, obituaries, and genealogies first. And then, if they're not in those, go to Bible records, newspapers, immigration and immigration records, and adoptions. So those are some good suggestions. But what you'll really want to do is look for the FamilySearch Wiki article for your state, country, or county, whatever most specific article exists, and look at that and then broaden out to the next largest jurisdiction. So if you're starting with the town, then go out to the county, then to the state, and then to the country, and see which records are available at each jurisdiction. And then you can see what they suggest searching in for certain items, because several states have their own record finders as well. So if you go to the Florida State Record Finder, it might have different information based on what that state has.
So, just for fun, while you were talking, I looked up the England record finder and I wanted to compare that a little bit to the United States record finder. And you and I have both done some English research, so we know this. But if you are looking for a birth date, then England had civil registration beginning in 1837. So that's something the United States doesn't have on a countrywide basis, is a civil registration. And so right there, that's the very first thing that is listed. And then church records, because the Church of England had tons and tons of records where they would record birth information, christening information. So it really is so beneficial to go to your specific country or state to see what you should be searching.
Oh, when you said that, I thought of a great example. So our third great grandmother, Sarah Jane Miller Bradley, she kind of was listed in our genealogy as Sarah Jane Bradley, but she never went by that name in her life because she was born to a single woman, Ann Miller. So she took her mother's surname, but her father's name, as listed in her baptism record into the Mormon Church, was Bradley. So people in the genealogy started putting her as Sarah Jane Bradley as her maiden name. But before Sarah was married, she always went by Sarah Jane Miller. Anyway, a strange family story was passed down about her that she died as a baby because a researcher couldn't find her baptismal record in England. But the researcher had come to the conclusion that the sister, Elizabeth, had taken on her dead sister's identity to get cheaper passage on the ship so that she wouldn't have to pay the adult fare. And then after that, she just kept the name Sarah. So I decided to see if that was a true story. And I thought if I can just prove that there are two separate people who grew to adulthood named Sarah Miller and Elizabeth Miller, then that would disprove this theory, which had been circulated among our family. And so the researcher had only looked in the church records for births in England and not the civil registrations, like you mentioned, which began in 1837. And so I looked in those civil registration records and found a record of Sarah Jane's birth. And she was listed as Sarah Jane Miller with her mother, Ann Miller, and no father listed, and it was listed as an illegitimate birth. And so I also found that her sister was born before 1837, so she wasn't in there. But I did find that she lived to adulthood, so I disproved the story that one sister died and the other one took on her identity. So anyway, if the researcher that had used that civil registration index and found the original registration, she wouldn't have come to that wrong conclusion.
And that's a great example, too, of not following genealogy standards because she tried to fit something to her conclusion without doing that reasonably exhaustive research and searching for all the available records to try to prove something. So,
Yeah.
we all learn, and I'm sure she was doing the best she could with what she had at the time.
Yeah, this was in the 50s, so I have to give her credit for going back to England and looking in the church parish records.
Yeah. But we do have the opportunity now to have more access to the records. So, if you're listening and you're thinking, wow, I wonder if that research that was done in my family years ago is correct, you may want to relook at it because it may have something that's not absolutely correct. And with our greater access to records, and I think that there's just so much more knowledge now about how to do research. Back in the day, I don't think it was as easy to learn because we didn't have the internet. We couldn't watch webinars, and people were just kind of doing it in their own way. And now we have standards and we have so many different things to help us be better researchers. So I want to just do a little case study here about a mistake I made back in the day. I was doing a project where I had been asked to find the parents of a certain individual, and it wasn't that far back. It was like 1800s in Georgia, I believe. And I had made a research plan, but my research plan was not as good as it should have been because to find a parent in the 1800s, and especially in Georgia, where a lot of people had wills and probate because they had land, I should have done probate first. And instead, I had it about number 3 on my list. And number 1, I had censuses. Well, censuses are great too, as we all know, and especially after 1880 when they start listing relationships. But I believe this was before 1880. So I got off on this tangent of searching censuses, and I was putting together families and having so much fun and spending all this time doing this. And then I found out when I finally got to probate that right there, very easily accessible on Ancestry, was a probate record. And it was the will, and it specifically stated all the relationships that I had just spent a little bit more time than, 5 minutes putting together. So it was a really good learning experience for me. Like I said, this was several years ago, and it really taught me to prioritize because if I had looked for the probate first, within 5 minutes, I would have had all the relationships of the family, and then I could have used census records to verify those, and it would have been a much more efficient project. So I have learned my lessons. We all have to learn over the years how to do our research better, but just something to think about prioritizing and using the records, trying the records first that are most likely to give us good results.
Right. And I think it takes some patience as well if we have to wait for a record to come back. Like when I ordered a probate record, or let's see, it was an estate file from the family history library, and I sent you and dad up to get it. Thank you. And it took a couple weeks because it was in the vault. So the library had to order it from the vault. And then you guys had to go back. And I had looked at the census records already. But when the estate file came back, it answered a lot of the questions that I had from the census records because this particular family in 1850 had what looked like some grandchildren living with them without the parents. So when I got the estate files back that I was looking at, they explained that the mother had died and she was the heir. And so the children needed guardians. And in order to inherit, they had to have a guardian. So that was in the probate file as well. So all that information was much clearer in the probate records and the estate file than it was in the census. In the census, it just told me their names and ages, but I didn't know the relationships. So yeah, it does sometimes take some patience, but I think now a lot of these records are becoming digitized. So it's becoming so much easier to use probate and estate files than it was 10 years ago.
Right. So we might have, years ago put that way down on our prioritized list, but now it could maybe be moved up because you see on FamilySearch that it's digitized. It's available for you to look at home, look at it while you're just sitting at your computer, and there's an index at the beginning of the microfilm. I mean, so, once you learn about the records and how to access them, it can really help you to prioritize, knowing how easy it will be to find them, knowing what's going to be found in them. And, if nothing else, it just makes you put some order to your research. And, when it comes right down to it, what does it matter? Nicole, you and I might prioritize something a little bit different. We could have in our research plans the same 5 records, but maybe you would want to search something before I would. And that's okay. We all are going to be a little bit different with how we want to do this research. The important thing is that we are making a plan and that we're following it, and it's keeping us focused on our objective and not just clicking around and not ever coming to a real conclusion. So, which is
Right.
why we love the Research Like a Pro process, because we actually make progress.
Yeah. I think that's a great question to ask, is how important is it to prioritize your list exactly correct? And I think as beginners and intermediates, we're still in the process of figuring things out. And so it's not, a big deal if you don't prioritize your list the way we would, or whatever, if it's not perfect. But when you get better, and if you're, becoming a professional where you charge people by the hour, then it is pretty important that you are efficient and that you put, those best sources in your research plan towards the top so that the client's time isn't wasted. So as you become more advanced, and especially if you're charging clients, it's pretty important to make sure you're searching those best records. Well, I think I will share my little case study of prioritizing. I searched for 2 years to figure out who Lucinda Keaton's parents were. And I had a hypothesis. I'd gathered a lot of records that were easy to find about the hypothesis, William Keaton. And I had made timelines. I had done a lot of clipping to Evernote and saving all these different things, but not really sure what to do with them. But finally, I did this project for the Research Like a Pro study group. And I realized that William Keaton died in 1830 and owned land. So I immediately put at the top of my list to go and get his estate file. And it was harder to access. We had to have somebody go to the family history library and order it. And when they did, it came back listing all the children, including Lucinda, except for her name was Lucindrilla. So I learned something about her, and her husband, which I knew was George Welch. So, I could have found the answer a lot quicker had I just known to do a research plan and learn about the locality and figure out what records were out there. As soon as I found out there were estate files at the Family History Library on microfilm, I knew I needed to search them. So I was just missing that locality guide and research planning step, and I did prioritize that high on my list and found it and solved the case. That's just a plug for the Research Like a Pro process and how successful it can help us be in solving our family's mysteries and questions. So we hope that you guys will take advantage of our sales this week on the Research Like a Pro eCourse that you can go through at your own pace and watch the videos and do the assignments and share them in the Facebook group. Come and ask your questions in office hours. And if you haven't got our book yet, now is a great time as well because the ebook is on sale. So check it out. All right. We'll talk to you guys again next week.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro